tradução do inglês para o português, tem que pegar o aparelho aqui do lado de fora do auditório.
If you need interpretation on site, you need interpreting gear, a headset. We are going to start in a few minutes. If you need interpretation on site.
Júlio, esperando para iniciar, acho que eles têm que abrir, né? Para a gente iniciar. Podemos iniciar?
Só estão pedindo para esperar.
We get Kenneth Zeichner with us. He's located in Seattle, USA. I believe he's not very happy with Botafogo, who beat Seattle Sounders last night 2-1.
Hello. Hello.
Vai pedir a senha. Não, aqui é o nome. A senha. Agora. Eu vou fechar tudo. Oi, teste. 1, 2, testando. Ei, som. Ei, som. Testando. 1, 2, teste de áudio. 1, 2, testando. 1, 2, som. Oi, som. Testando. 1, 2, teste de áudio.
Pessoas presentes nesse evento, bem como as pessoas que nos assistem.
Good afternoon, everybody who is present here in person, as well as through YouTube. Welcome to the continuation of our very beautiful and potent event, the International Workshop called Third Spaces in Teacher Education, Theoretical Conceptual Discussions and Methodological Implications for Research Practices and Teacher Education Policies. Our event started this morning, and now in the afternoon session, we'll have two lectures, and after them we'll have a debate involving both of the talks. We have on the panel myself, Professor Rita, I represent Univille from the state of Santa Catarina, Brazil, and Jussara, who will also be here with us to coordinate the talk by Professor Zeichner and she's from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. The speaker of the first lecture will be Professor António Nóvoa. Professor António Nóvoa is a full professor at the Fundep, Magda Soares seat, Basic Education, IEAT, UFMG between 2024 and 2025. He is the honorary dean and emeritus professor of the Lisbon University in Portugal. Professor, to read your texts is always a pleasure to us, but to listen to you from up close is a very special moment. Welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation to give this international presence to our event. We give the floor to Professor Nóvoa now, who will talk to us about common spaces in teacher education.
Não sei tirar essa.
Mais uma vez, quem precisar de tradução
Once again,
do
if you need
português para
interpretation
o
between
inglês,
Portuguese and English,
tem que pegar o aparelho
please
do
pick
lado
up
de
your
fora
headset
do auditório,
outside
levar um
of the
documento,
auditorium,
né,
bring some
para
ID
ouvir as traduções.
so that you can listen to the translation.
Ficou bem melhor.
Essa aqui é aquela que a gente...
Muito obrigado, muito boa tarde.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. When I came to the microphone, I got a bit scared. I believe you needed translation to understand me. But that was not the case, so I'm more at ease now. It's a pleasure to share the panel with our two colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be here once again with you to talk about this project, this intent, this policy of common spaces for teacher education. I have the feeling that I've talked about this for so long, especially at this auditorium, that sometimes it's hard to find a new angle or a new perspective or a new way to talk about the same thing. I have tried to find a slightly different angle from the ones that I have shared with you at different occasions, but actually we're here to talk about the same thing, right? We're always talking about the same project, of the same intent, of the same purpose. At this today's share, I thought I would start with a pretty well-known reference by Aristotle when he says that in order to think, we need images. We cannot think if we don't have images. This is said it's put in a simpler way, meaning that in order to think, we need to imagine. We need imagination. We need to imagine the action. That means to think makes us think with a certain imaginary. It compels us to use our imagination, and imagination is not what's in the clouds. Imagination is what allows us to imagine a certain action. We imagine action, imagination. It's a purpose. It's a purpose to realize something. And upon thinking about Aristotle, and when we hear the idea of Aristotle's images, please allow me to take a more personal direction. I thought about my first master, the advisor of my first PhD dissertation, Professor Daniel Hamelin from the Geneva University, who wrote a whole compilation of work, a book, to explain that education discourse is always historically along centuries constructed based on metaphors. And that the educational study is metaphorical, and he explains along a volume of 300 pages, hundreds of metaphors that permeate the educational space in order to talk about professors, teachers, talk about education, talk about learning, and the ways how metaphors are very powerful images in order to think about education. Amidst all of the metaphors that abound in education, maybe the most well-known of all, the most known is the infamous metaphor of the plants. It's a metaphor that's been made popular by the new education, by the new school. It's the idea that the child is a sapling, a small plant that will develop in and of itself, and we should not interfere in its normal development, in the normal development of a child, or in this case, a plant, other than watering it with care and tenderness so that they can develop in harmony. As you know, the plant metaphor has given rise to thousands of texts that have permeated the educational and pedagogical space in the 20th century, and also concrete designations. In France, to this day, a children's teacher is designated as a gardener, jardinier d'enfants. It's the idea of kindergarten being a garden, and the kids are plants. But Daniel Hanlin says, be careful with metaphors, because every metaphor have ambiguity. They include ambiguity. They include different ways of looking at them. Metaphors never say only one thing. They have a way of simplifying reality, but they allow for always a more or less significant degree of ambiguity in their understanding. And in the plant metaphor, Daniel Hamelin, after spending several pages discussing the beauty of the plant metaphor, the beauty of this idea of children with their autonomy and their spontaneity growing up, and we merely have to briefly take care of them by watering them with tenderness. And after spending several pages discussing the beauty of the plant metaphor, Daniel Hamelin reminds us of the instruments used by the gardeners: pliers, scissors, hoes, backhoes, spades. Truly, these are pretty much torture instruments, and the plant metaphor loses most of its original beauty when it reminds us that a metaphor might have several different readings at the same time, and it always allows for a large degree of ambiguity. Why am I saying this to you at the beginning of my lecture? Because the third space, what we have been discussing here along so many months, is an image. It is a metaphor. And as such, it allows for a huge degree of ambiguity. It allows for a huge degree of uncertainty. It is not a systematic, structured proposal. It's not organized. It's not fixed with very clear boundaries and very clear methods, with very clear educational framing. No, it is not. It is an image. It's a metaphor, including all of its uncertainties, all of its ambiguities. However, it is an image which allows us to imagine and which allows us to imagine the action, imagination, which allows us to construct a certain imaginary of the places where we want to reach, of the things we want to do, and they are made up or constituted or organized at the margin of the uncertainty. The idea of the third space is not something that will come from an organic thinking or dimension, from a structured or planned thinking. On the contrary, it's something that comes from a need, from a reality. It sprouts from a project, and it makes us mobilize. And that's imagining the action and imagining the ways to which we are invited to tread without knowing very well where we're going to get, but knowing that there is a path to follow, and this path will probably, in and of itself, be important regardless later of the locations where it will lead us or the locations where we believe it will lead us to. When we talk about the third space and the academic literature, now when we think more academically, when we talk about the third space, the academic literature is enormously abundant. I have checked only the state of the art about the concept of third space in English. I'm talking about the literature in English alone. And recently, back in 2024, two of our colleagues, Clara Thorpe and Helen Partridge, wrote a review, a state-of-the-art review, a balance of the use of the concept of third space only in higher education. The concept of third space is used for many other things, industry and culture, communities, etc., but only in the area of higher education. And in the period between 2000 and 2022, they found 2,870 scientific articles discussing the use of the concept of third space only in the area of higher education. And why am I saying this to you? I'm telling you this in order to show you that a metaphor such as that, an image such as that, has been used in so many different ways. Some of them I see myself in, others in which I do not. But what's important here is what, in our case, in the case of this Minas Gerais network for teacher education, that you have been putting together along the last months, we can actually talk about the last few years, right? By mobilizing the 19 higher institutions in the state of Minas Gerais. So how is this image or this metaphor being used in this network and also in what moves us throughout this workshop? And it has been utilized especially in order to think about what is known as professional university education. And I'd like to underline the word professional here. Typically, universities have always had education for professions, of professions rather, and the education of the so-called liberal arts, sciences, humanities, etc., with courses which did not directly lead to a profession. That is a division that is no longer used, but nonetheless, if we look at the increase of the courses at UFMG or the large part of better part of the universities, we clearly find this idea of university education and professional education in the courses of medicine and other health and related courses, pharmacy, physical therapy, etc. The courses in the areas of law, engineering, architecture, and also teacher education. There, of course, are other courses which have a professional character, but in general, these are the 5 areas which typically characterize courses which have a professional dimension in the space of the universities. And in order to characterize these courses, and within the way of thinking about the curricula and the organization of these courses, that the idea of third space has been used, in our case, in the area of teacher education, which is the area of interest to us, about which I will weave my reflections. Therefore, it is necessary to make it clear that even if we have so many different other uses of this image or this metaphor for so many different other ends, today I bring it to you in order to characterize education or professional university education, and specifically in the area of teacher education. Hence the title of this intervention, Common Spaces of Teacher Education. In a very simple manner, maybe even in an excessively simple way, we can say that it's about finding or defining a meeting point between universities, or in a more general way, higher education institutions and basic education schools. We need to find a meeting point between the academic dimension, the academic spaces, the academic realities, the academic cultures, and the professional dimensions, professional cultures, and school cultures. I would like to open a parenthesis here in order to, unless I am mistaken at some point in my lecture, to tell you that I will never, unless I'm mistaken, I will never use the difference between theory and practice, which seems to me to be of little interest in order to think about what is gathering us here today. To talk about, we can talk about professional dimensions, sometimes about the academic dimensions, and also the professional dimensions, which seem to me to be a more interesting way and a more productive way to think about what is gathering us here today. Because I will refuse to think or believe that universities are only about theory, and above all, I refuse to think that basic education schools or that basic education is merely practice. It is not. And therefore, I always try to escape this dichotomy. I hope I will not make any mistakes along my intervention. And many times I, you know, tend to fall into this dichotomy, which is not very interesting to me, and I'd rather not do that. What it's all about is finding a meeting point between these two realities, a meeting point that is more than a mere connection, and which will allow us to create a third reality, the third spaces. And you will hear me talking about the third, the aspect of the third in my intervention. We're talking about the common spaces for teacher education as a third reality, as a third thing, if you will, which somehow gathers universities and schools, but also but it gathers them in order to produce a new reality, not only in order to consecrate a mere articulation or a mere encounter between these two realities, the reality of higher education and the reality of basic education. Upon resorting to this image, to this metaphor, of course, it mostly aims at going beyond binarisms, dichotomies between, such as the dichotomy between practice and theory, go beyond exclusions and hierarchies, which are so strong in the domain of teacher education, especially between universities and basic education schools. Here, we have an intention. Here, we have the imagining of a purpose of an action which aims at going beyond the dichotomic thinking, the binary uh, thinking, going beyond exclusions and hierarchy. There is an intent, a very clear purpose in the use of this image to create a role and affirm the presence of basic education teachers in the education of their future colleagues. That is the idea that in university professional education, profession must be present. And for medical professional education, doctors have to be present. For engineering professional educations, engineers must be present. For professional education from the point of view of teachers, then of course teachers, basic education teachers have to be present.
To consecrate, firm their role and firm their presence in the context of the programs of teacher training. It is therefore, in some way, of going beyond these binarisms, dichotomies, with what we all know, in our case, are also hierarchies that define very clearly both in education and both in teacher training. There is an intention, also a purpose, to give value, to in other lectures I've spoken of the idea of widening the vital space of teachers, the vital space of the profession, and their capacity for intervention in the training of the future teachers. This implies very clearly three movements, which in some way, in the configuration of this ambiguous space, which can be translated pragmatically and concretely into these two blocks, or 400 hours, another 320 hours, which are established in the curricular guidelines for teacher training approved last year in 2024, with one block of 400 hours, which is called in the guidelines as an internship, a supervised internship, and which bring 320 hours for which is called activities, extension activities. In this same resolution of curricular guidelines for teacher training, there is an idea, interesting idea, that both the 400 hours of the internship and the 320 hours of academic extension, since the beginning of the course, there should be since the first quarter to the last semester, and have to be done in the education, the basic education schools. There are two affirmations which are very clear in these guidelines and which make up a challenge, a very important challenge to think these common professor training or teacher training spaces. They are for mainly fulfill three purposes. The first is to ensure a strong participation, a legitimate participation, or if you like, legitimated training of basic education teachers in the professional socialization of their future colleagues. This is the work of professional socialization can only be done by other professionals, by other teachers. And for this, it's necessary to create conditions for participation, strong and legitimate participation of these teachers in the socialization processes. A course, an education, professional university training implies, besides many other things, it implies a process of socialization, professional socialization, and appropriation and integration inside a given profession. That is why we have a strong idea of consecrating the basic education teachers as training teachers of other teachers. Obviously, basic education teachers are already trainers. They train the children. They're educators by nature, and they are trainers. But the concept of trainer is used as trainers of other teachers. And if they have this role in a very clear way and unequivocal way, with the risk otherwise of having a kind of a gap, an empty of difficulties of consecrating this socialization, this professional socialization. The second purpose, again, can be consecrated in these 400 plus 320 hours, is to ensure that this participation of the teachers is based on their own and specific knowledge, which I have designated as professional teacher knowledge. This is beyond the knowledge of the scientific content, which are indispensable, history, maths, biology, beyond the subjects show the fundamental of science of education, of the teaching, equally indispensable. There is a third kind of knowledge. Let's often use the word third, which is professional knowledge, teaching knowledge, which is a different order. And in fact, is a kind big gap or a big black hole in our educational thinking and in our pedagogical reflection, and hasn't been part of well-structured thinking. It has not been well-structured. And as I said in a discussion the day before yesterday with our colleague Magda, who is a great honor to be here with us, And as I said, Menga, this knowledge is knowledge that needs to be worked on, that needs reflection. Very often when we put the teachers into the role of authors, we give them only the idea that they are authors. They can say all of their life stories, they can talk about their biographies, and it's interesting that they can talk about the practices, the narratives in the practice. It's interesting because when they say this, we are consecrating as authors of knowledge that is this teaching professional knowledge. This implies the work that Menga has done over the years of thinking what are the research professors, what this means precisely. And what it means is certainly not that the teachers, research professors, is that those who are going to do academic research in the university. It's not in this sense that I brought the idea. It's a professor who is a researcher and who produces this professional teaching knowledge and not that which is going to do work only in academia, which is also good. I'm not questioning that, but it is a different kind of research. It has a different nature. It has different consequences. Training teachers, research teachers, and finally, this common space have a third dimension or a third purpose, which for me is huge importance to ensure from this common space you build and reinforce public action of the teachers in the institutions, in the participation, democratic participations in the management of schools, in society, and also in the public debate and public education policies. It is a space that is missing for the teachers. Teachers don't have room, their own room, space where they can express their feeling and their proposals from the point of view public action. Obviously, that to the union, there are unions, there are teacher associations, they're very important, but we're talking about something else. Their main objective is to protect, very important, legitimate and necessary, of the interests of the rights, of the materiality of the professions, the salaries, their conditions, also being very important. But we need spaces where we can project another capacity of public action, and these common spaces can be also this place of affirmation of what I said, designate, maybe it's a little strange, the public teachers, the teachers who have a public voice, who have a public presence, who are recognized publicly, and whose voice is alive, is listened to, is thought of, which is part of our way of solving the education. We have as a purpose, therefore, quality, why not use the word politics? Politic in the sense of, in this wider sense of participation in the polis, a public participation in the universities, in collective life, the affirmation of the teachers in basic education as training teachers, as research teachers, and as public teachers. And this will be done, has to be done today in a time of great changes in education. I'm not going to talk about this today. I have already said this on other occasions, but this common space has to be also spaces of tests of experimentation for the change of education, for the metamorphosis of the school, a concept that some will know I've used in some observations of the French philosopher Edgar Morin, and have worked in systematically on this concept. This is at the bottom, deep down, in a way which is more brutal. We cannot fail education, change in education. The metamorphosis in the school should be done outside the school spaces by foundations, organizations, technology, digital, the big digital oligarchies that think about this change and that impose change from outside in. We have to find public spaces. What matters is the public dimension, spaces of testing, experimentation, innovation. I confess I very much like the word innovation. I prefer the word change and the change metamorphosis of the school. This is, saying it in a different way, the training of the teachers has to be done in spaces which are areas, spaces of change and of testing and experimentation, cannot be done exclusively in the schools, normal, regular schools, where nothing interesting happens, where there isn't great pedagogical initiative. It has to be done in places which are more vibrant places, where things are happening, where there is a certain agitation in the best sense of the term, pedagogical, educational, etc. For this to happen, for these common spaces or third spaces taken as an image, as a picture, as a metaphor, as something which is new. It's not a structure, fixed, organic, prepared, planned. It's like something that is molded, which is being built, even in different ways. That is, they will come here in the intervention. Kenneth Zeichner, that obviously the great author who over recent years has spoken of the third spaces or the hybrid spaces involving use this metaphor more with the link to the communities and the attention that people have to have to the communities in which they're going to work, the communities that are more personalized, communities that have had less voice, less visibility, use of this image, of this metaphor, creating that which I'm doing, however, extraordinarily important and very significant. To build this space, it's necessary to say very clearly that I said at the beginning of this presentation that the universities in and of themselves can't create these places. But the schools, the basic education schools of themselves cannot of themselves create these spaces. It's not possible when thinking of these spaces as a creation of the university only, or think of these spaces as a creation of the schools only. This famous picture, which I disagree with completely, that teacher training is done basically in the school for the people to basically do in the space of in practice. No, neither the universities on their own can instigate, have the power of these third spaces, nor the schools all of themselves are able to do this. It's necessary to come together. We have to come bring together, but bring it together, creating this third reality, creating the third reality that leads through a long process of dialogue and negotiation inside the universities, inside the schools. The process of dialogue and participation with university teachers, with the supervisors of internships, the municipal authorities, with the state authorities, with many logics in society. The visibility of the process is very important. It's very important that you speak about this in the Senate, you talk about it in social communication, that there is a process of dialogue, negotiation, involving the communities, and Zeichner will say in a moment, involving a set of people or players in this construction, collective construction. And for this process to have a certain capacity and feasibility
se concretizar em ação ou em política, se quiserem, há 5 questões que é preciso assegurar. Eu vou dizê-las de maneira relativamente rápida para não alongar a minha intervenção. Primeiro, é preciso assegurar condições internas nas universidades de valorização das licenciaturas e de compreensão de que numa educação profissional universitária é fundamental uma presença forte do respectivo campo profissional, neste caso, do campo da educação básica. É um trabalho interno nas universidades que tem sido conduzido de maneira muito sustentada aqui na UFMG e nas restantes 18 instituições mineiras de formação de professores, que no caso da UFMG levou mesmo à criação de uma diretoria, não me lembro exatamente o nome, Júlio, Maria, diretoria, de uma diretoria que se chama Universidade de Educação Básica, óbvio, não tinha visto, estava a olhar para cima, de uma diretoria que se chama Universidade de Educação Básica, justamente para criar estas condições internas nas universidades, em vez da fragmentação de licenciaturas, da fragmentação de ideias do que é uma licenciatura, de muitas vezes de uma licenciatura que não é licenciatura, que é um bacharelato, etc. Há aqui um trabalho interno nas universidades que tem de ser feito e que, sem o qual dificilmente conseguiremos caminhar na proposta que eu estou a fazer. É preciso também assegurar que os professores universitários estão disponíveis e estão interessados e têm condições, isto é, que este trabalho lhes é reconhecido e têm condições para irem trabalhar para as escolas de educação básica, pelo menos nos núcleos das diretrizes curriculares nacionais, as tais 400 horas mais 320 horas dedicadas ao estágio, dedicados ao estágio supervisionado e às atividades de extensão. Isto é, que os seus universitários estão disponíveis para este trabalho e não apenas para enviarem os estagiários para as escolas, dizendo o que é que eles têm que ir lá fazer, sem verdadeiramente se envolverem eles próprios, não é? Numa vivência, num trabalho, numa presença concreta, não é? Na vida das escolas de educação básica. Claro que para isto é preciso haver condições. É preciso haver condições para que este trabalho seja reconhecido. É preciso que continuar os professores. É preciso que haja condições concretas para que isto se realize. Nada disto se faz, há muita coisa se faz por boa vontade, mas é evidente que não se institucionaliza uma política apenas com base na boa vontade. É preciso criar as condições para que isso aconteça. Aliás, não é preciso inventar muito, basta ver as condições que os professores de medicina têm para irem acompanhar os seus estagiários ou os seus residentes nos hospitais ou
but
nos espaços da
or
saúde.
in the
É
spaces
criar
of
condições
creating
idênticas
identical
para que isso
conditions
possa
for this to
acontecer
be able to
com os
happen
professores
with the
universitários
university
na
teachers
área
in
da formação de professores.
training of professionals.
Em terceiro
In
lugar,
third place,
é preciso
we
assegurar
have to ensure
que aquelas algumas, se a expressão me
the
é
few
permitida,
schools, if you
que
allow me,
aquelas
the
algumas
few
escolas,
basic education
poucas,
schools, very
de
few
educação básica,
basic
ou pelo
education
menos
schools, or at
poucas
least
ao
few
princípio,
in
de
principle,
educação básica, que
who
venham a
will become
constituir-se como terceiros
third
espaços,
spaces, take on
assumam
the
a sua
responsibility
responsabilidade na
in the
formação de
training of
professores,
teachers.
isto é,
They
assumam
take on
a sua missão
their
de
mission
escolas
as
formadoras
training
e
schools
tenham
and have
condições
concrete
concretas
conditions
para cumprir
to
esta
fulfill this
responsabilidade.
responsibility.
Estamos aqui a
Here,
ver que no
see
caso
that
da
in the
rede mineira
case
de formação
of
de
the
professores,
Mineira
a
network of training,
maneira como este terceiro
how the
espaço,
third space,
como
the
esta
way in which this
imagem
image
se tem
has
vindo a
come
constituir
become
é através
through
da
the
escolha
choice
de algumas
of
escolas de
a
educação
few
básica,
basic education schools,
municipais,
municipal,
estaduais,
state,
eventualmente
and
federais,
even federal,
como é o
as
caso
is the case
das
of
escolas que
the
estão
schools
ligadas às
linked to the
universidades, que
universities,
se venham a
they
constituir como
become
terceiros
a third
espaços.
space.
Os terceiros espaços
Third space
poder-se-ão consagrar de outras
be
maneiras.
consecrated in other
Noutros
ways. In
países
other
têm-se
countries,
consagrado de
they have
outras
been established
maneiras.
in other
O
ways.
modo como
The
aqui se tem
way
vindo
they
a
have
pensar
is
essa
distinct
Constituição
to how
é
they're
a
set up
partir da escolha
from
de
the choice
algumas
of a
destas
few of
escolas de
these
educação
basic
básica
education schools
que queiram dizer,
that is
no seu
in
projeto
their design,
pedagógico,
pedagogical
no seu
design,
projeto
the
educativo,
educational
que,
design,
para além da
beyond
educação das
the
crianças,
education of the
tem uma
children,
segunda
there's a
missão,
second
que é a
mission,
missão de
which
formar os
is to
professores
train teachers
e
and
progressivamente,
progressively
inclusive,
also
possam assumir tarefas
can
não
take
só
on
na
tasks
formação
not just
inicial,
of
mas
initial
também na
training,
formação
but
continuada
continuing
e
education
até
and
nas
even
políticas
in
de
the
indução profissional.
production
Claro que estas
policies.
escolas
Obviously, the
têm de ter
schools
condições
have to have
concretas para
concrete
isso.
conditions to
Têm de
do this.
ter
They have to have
flexibilidade, têm de ter
flexibility,
autonomia
they have to have
curricular,
curricular
têm de ter
autonomy,
formas
they have to have
diferentes de
different ways
organizar
of
os horários,
organizing
de organizar o
timetables, the
currículo,
curriculum,
têm que estar
they have to be
disponíveis para a
available
tal dinâmica
to
de ensaio e de
dynamic of test
experimentação
and
de que eu vos falava,
experimentation that I was
têm que
talking
ter
about.
condições
They have to have
materiais,
material
têm que ter
conditions, they have to have
espaços,
space,
espaços onde os professores
spaces where
universitários
the
possam
university
trabalhar com as
teachers
pessoas de
can work
educação
with the basic
básica
education
e
teachers
com os
and
licenciandos.
with the
Há
initial.
muitas
There are
condições
many
que é preciso
conditions
cumprir.
that have to be met.
Claro que estas
Obviously,
condições
these
não vão
conditions
estar
aren't
todas
all
dadas à
given
partida.
initially.
Só
So
fazemos
do it
se as
if
condições
the
estiverem
conditions
todas
are all
asseguradas. Isso não
assured.
existe,
That
não é?
doesn't
A melhor
exist.
maneira para não fazer
Best
nada
way
na
to do
vida
nothing in
é
life
dizer eu
is
só
to say, oh,
faço
well, I'll only do it
quando
when
tudo for
everything is
perfeito é
perfect.
que eu dou um
Then
passo.
I'll take the
Não.
first step. No.
Nós temos que ir
We
dando
have to
passos
take
e
steps
temos que ir
and we have to
construindo.
build.
E temos que ir
We have to
construindo essa
build this
realidade. Pela
reality
nossa palavra, pela nossa
with our
presença,
presence,
pelo nosso
our
esforço,
speech,
pelo nosso
with our effort
trabalho,
and our
por
work,
aquilo que vamos
so that
mostrando
we
e
show and
demonstrando.
demonstrate.
Quarto
Fourth
aspecto
aspect
do que é
of what
preciso
is
assegurar,
necessary to ensure,
é preciso
we have
assegurar
to assure
que
that
aquelas
the
escolas de educação
basic
básica,
education
aquelas
schools,
algumas,
the
poucas
very
escolas de
few
educação
basic
básica,
education
que
schools
venham a
that become
constituir-se como
third
terceiros espaços,
spaces
assumam
take
a tal
on
matriz de
metrics of
ensaio e de
test and
experimentação,
experimentation.
isto é,
That
que se
is,
assumam como
they
escolas
become
formadoras
training
e
schools,
também como escolas
transforming schools, and
transformadoras
transforming
no
schools
contexto
in
dos processos de
context
mudança
of
em
the
educação
processes
e
of
de
change in
metamorfose
education
da
and the
escola.
metamorphosis
E,
of
portanto,
the
é
school.
preciso que esta
This
matriz
metric
esteja,
has to
e
be
aliás,
actually,
não vos estou a
I'm not
falar de nada
speaking anything
absolutamente extraordinário,
extraordinary here.
estou a
I'm
falar-vos
speaking
daquilo
of what
que
which
historicamente
historically
levou
led
a que as
to
escolas
the
normais de
normal
formação de professores
school
no
training
século
schools in the
XIX
19th
e no
century and the
princípio do
beginning of the
século XX,
20th century
estivessem ao seu
had
lado, nós designávamos em
the
Portugal
which
escolas
in Portugal
anexas,
annex
que eram
schools,
escolas
which were
anexas de
schools
ensaio e de
annexed for
experimentação, não é?
test
Em
and
função do que se fazia da
experimentation
formação de professores, vocês
in the
chamavam,
teacher
creio eu,
training. I
escolas
think
de
the
aplicação, davam-lhes
application
outros
schools
nomes.
are the names
Não
we
estou a
use.
falar
I'm
de
not
nada que
saying of
seja
anything
absolutamente
that's
extraordinário
extraordinary at
e
all
nunca
and
pensado na história
never
da
thought of
educação.
before in education.
Aliás, na área da
In
educação e da pedagogia já
education,
foi tudo
everything's
pensado,
already been
já
thought
foi
of.
tudo dito,
Everything has
não é? Não
been
há nenhuma
said. There's
novidade,
no novelty
mas
here. But historical recontextualization of many things. And this is what I am suggesting and proposing. And finally, and very important, maybe even the most important, we have to ensure the participation. I hesitate a lot using this word. When I write these PowerPoints, I choose very carefully the words I put up. I hesitate a lot in the use of the best. But after hesitating a lot, I decided to write it. The participation of the best basic education teachers, recognizing their role, and auctoritas, I'm going to make a parenthesis about this, as teacher trainers and giving them, obviously, conditions and the counterparts, they have the right. It's not ask them to do more than they already do. It's not to ask them to have more tasks than those that they already do. It's give them the condition and the resources, material, symbolic, prestige, training, career. There are many counter payments that can be provided, and in some way allow them to take on fully their role as professional teacher trainers. I also spoke with Aminga 2 days ago and with other colleagues, and they have already did an intervention in UFMG about this concept. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but for me, maybe the most important of everything in basic education, teachers, and the great problem, maybe the big problem with what we are finding in this kind of reduction of the profession is a loss of auctoritas of the teachers. And auctoritas is the contrary of authoritarianism. Don't read auctoritas as authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, which imposes over others. I impose my authority. Auctoritas is what others, it's what others recognize in me. It's authority that others recognize in me, but it's also authorship, and the usual professional in the authority is the dimension of professional culture that I spoke about at the beginning. In authorship is the dimension of professional knowledge of which I spoke about next, and then the authorization is the dimension of the public dimension.
Just to use a public intervention or participation in public policies. I'd like to open this parenthesis here because largely this is what I will be writing about in the next few months, and I would like to mention this quickly in order to define my last point here, the need for recognizing the role of professors or teachers rather, and their auctoritas. And notice the verb that I'm using, recognizing their role. We recognize their statute, their authority, their authorship, and their authorization as teacher educators, and of course finding the conditions and countermeasures which are due. To sum up and to wrap up, because we all want to hear Professor Kenneth Zeichner's words and the lecture that he will be giving right afterwards. And I know that Professor Zeichner is listening to us. I'd like to extend my sympathy and my admiration for his work. And in order to wrap up, I'd like to tell you that these third spaces, in the way or any way that they will take on, will become great public spaces for reference, locations where we think about the profession, where we think about education, where teacher education happens, locations where we will not let this moment, which is central for the change in schooling, will be thought outside of it. We have to think about it. We have to put it together. And it's a political struggle. Yes, it is. It's a professional struggle. Yes, it is. I'm not only talking about my organic, a mere organic arrangement. We're talking about creating a space which will be strong, which will have authoritas, which will be legitimate enough to be, at the same time, spaces for teacher training, for education, spaces for research in the sense that I've defined it, and also spaces for public action. Research not in the sense of academic research, but professional research, which is not either worse or better. It cannot be hierarchically considered as being smaller, but which is different from the academic research and which is conducted by other criteria, other pertinent aspects, and other types of legitimation. Of course, this demands a path. It demands a path, and the path I know is more the most banal of all quotes that I could bring to you is one that we have all of us said at some point in life, but António Machado is one of my favorite authors. He's a Spanish poet who has who was born close to where I was born. Is an author that I read a lot, and I have visited and revisited his work so much, and he has this famous quote, which is maybe the most famous poetic quote, or at least the most mentioned, when he says, Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. The walker does not have a path. The path is made upon walking. The path is done by walking the path. What we're saying is there is no predefined path for the construction of our third space. There is no finished proposal, which happens so many times when we're talking about private foundations or when organizations try to sell us a ready-made work for continued education, a curricular program. Everything is ready-made and all finished. All we have to do is to put it in the hands of schools and teachers. There's no product ready-made. We have a path to follow. And the path is the one that you have been following. Negotiation, conversation, searching together, collective construction of this path. That's what's happening. A path of collective construction of anything, which probably is going to be different from what happened in Rio de Janeiro with a similar initiative, which was the complex of teacher education. Probably it will be different from one institution in Minas Gerais to another in the same state. It's probably going to be different between different places and different contexts, but that is a path for putting together this project. This is what I had to say. And what I think is we cannot be indignated to a certain extent and not have a propositive action to the degradation of public school and its domination by logics of privatization and commercialization. We keep criticizing that, but then at the end of the day, what's our proposal? What are we going to do? How are we going to mobilize to follow a propositive action? And we cannot watch in a more or less indifferent way, but with no movement of change. We cannot watch the degradation of the statute and of the condition of teachers and the sequestering of the teacher education by private entities, which is so common in Brazil, but for initial and for continued education. As university community members, we have a higher responsibility given the education of the teachers because it is under our sphere of competence. There's so much to do. Teacher education is one of the many things that we have to do. We have to struggle for salaries, for better careers, for the dignity of the profession. There are many other struggles, other battles to fight. This is merely one of these battles, but that's one that belongs to us. It's in our responsibility. And one of the best ways to fulfill this responsibility, certainly not the only one, but without a doubt, one of the most inspiring ones, is the creation of common spaces for teacher education. This is what has brought me to UFMG. This is what has brought me to the Fundep Cátedra, Magda Soares for Basic Education. That's what brings me to Belo Horizonte, and that's what motivates my conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Bom, vamos
Let
fechar
us
essa primeira
wrap up this
palestra
first lecture
com o pensamento de
with
abertura da fala do professor
thinking about the
Nóvoa
opening
sobre
of
Sócrates.
Professor Noble's
Para começar, precisamos de imagens.
quote,
Gratidão,
Aristotle.
professor,
In order to think, we
pelas
need
imagens
images.
que nos
Thank you very
trouxeste-
much, Professor, for the
trouxeste
images
na
that
tua
you have
fala de
brought to
hoje.
us in your lecture today.
Permitiu
They
que
have allowed us
imaginássemos
to imagine
uma outra formação de
a
professores.
new way
Uma
of
formação
working with
como
teacher
processo que
education,
realmente busque
an
alargar
education as a
esse
process that
vital dos
aims to
professores.
aims at
seja,
broadening the vital space of
consolide
teachers.
o
In
espaço
other words,
comum,
which will consolidate the
terceiro
common
espaço.
space or the third space.
Obrigada
Thank
por
you
nos impulsionar
for moving
a
us
construir
ahead
o caminho
in terms of
andando. A
creating
imagem
our path
do
as we
caminho
walk. The
da
image of the
casa
path
ficará para sempre,
will be
ficará
forever,
por bom tempo,
or
né,
at least
na
for a
nossa
very long
memória.
time, ingrained in
Obrigada.
our memory. Thank you very
Vou
much.
passar a palavra
I will now give the
à
floor
professora
to
Jussara,
Professor Jussara,
que vai coordenar
and she
agora
will
a
now
segunda
coordinate the
palestra
second
dessa tarde.
lecture.
Bom, boa tarde
Good
a todas as
afternoon,
pessoas
everyone
presentes nesse
who are
auditório e também
located in
às
this
pessoas que nos
auditorium, and also
acompanham
to the
nos acompanham pela
members that
transmissão
are
pelo
following
YouTube.
the YouTube
Eu
transmission.
estou aqui acompanhando a Rita
I am
nas
together with
condução dos
Rita
trabalhos aqui
conducting
nesta tarde.
the
Meu
chairing
nome
the
é
panel this
Jussara
afternoon. My name is
Araújo,
Jussara
professora da
Araújo. I
área
am
de
a,
Pedagogia e membro da
professor at
equipe de
UFMG, and I'm a member of the managing
doutora
committee of the
Magda Soares,
Magda
da
Soares
Educação
Fundep
Básica do
Chair for Basic
UFMG.
Education at
Bom,
IET
então agora
UFMG.
eu passo
Right
a
now,
apresentar a
I
vocês
will
a segunda palestra
introduce
da
the
tarde
second
de hoje,
lecture
e lembrando
in
que logo em seguida nós
today's
vamos ter um debate
session.
com os
Right
nossos
after
professores,
this lecture, we'll have a
e
debate
lembrando
with these
que
two
a nossa
professors who are
tarde
enriching our afternoon
e a
session.
palestra de
And
agora vai ser
now's
proferida
lecture
em
is going
inglês,
to
então
be
é para
given in
preparar
English. So
para
if you
você
need
ligar o
interpretation,
aparelhinho aí da
it's
tradução.
important to put on your headsets now.
Bom, então agora
I will now
nós vamos ter a palestra
give the
Espaços
floor
Híbridos
to
para a
the
Formação de
lecture
Professores.
Hybrid Spaces in
É
Teacher
uma
Education.
honra
It is an
convidar
honor
o
to invite Professor Kenneth Zeichner,
professor
who is
emérito
an
da
emeritus professor
University of
of University of Wisconsin in Madison,
da
and
University
also
of Washington
University
em
of
Seattle,
Washington and Seattle, both of them in the United States of
e
America.
na próxima hora
And
irá
during the
falar
next
da
hour, he will be talking to
metodologia
us
dos espaços
about
híbridos para a
hybrid spaces
formação de
in teacher
professores.
education.
Professor
Professor
Zeichner,
Zeichner,
nós
we thank you
agradecemos
very much
a sua
for your
disponibilidade, a sua
availability and your
participação
participation
aqui
with
conosco
us
nesse seminário
in this
internacional
international
Terceiros
workshop,
Espaços na Formação de
Third Spaces
Professores.
in Teacher
Muito obrigada.
Education. Thank you very much. Professor, can you hear us? Take it away, please. Professor, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, you can go ahead and start your talk.
Where are my slides? As soon as you put the slides up, I'll start.
Hold on a second. Can you hear me?
Professor Kenneth.
Yes?
We are facing some technical problems. Hold on a second, please.
Can you start, please?
I sent the slides and they were going to be loaded on the screen. I sent them yesterday.
Just a minute.
Professor, your slides are up.
Thank you. Am I going to be able to operate them? You have to set it so that I can advance them.
Professor, can you hear me? This is the interpreter speaking.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
People here are going to pass the slides for you, okay?
All right, so I'll go like this, all right? Can you see me? When I go like this,
Yes.
you'll
Okay.
advance it to the next slide. All right?
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the sound okay? I'll assume that it is. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually from Seattle. Last night in Seattle, Botafogo was in Seattle, the football team from Brazil, playing the Seattle team, and the Brazilian team won the game 2-1. Congratulations. I'd like to talk to you today about some work that's been very important to me over the years that I have been working, 50 years or so, in teacher education. This work is about the importance of third spaces and shared responsibility for teacher preparation programs. And I want to say two things about the perspective I'm taking before I get into the details. The first is that my focus is on the United States, a context I know very well. I've also done a lot of traveling to other parts of the world during my career, including Brazil several times. And I know from my traveling that the conditions I'm going to describe that exist in the United States also exist in other parts of the world. But you will have to interpret to what extent does what I have to say, is it relevant to your own particular context? So the other thing is that I'm going to today focus on the practicalities of what it means to have third spaces and shared responsibility for teacher preparation, rather than on the underlying theories that support this approach. Because I think there's been a lot of confusion when the work has been translated from the theoretical realm into the world of practice and confusion. So anybody who wants me to provide a reference list of things you can read by different scholars about the underlying theories, I'd be happy to provide them, but I'm going to focus on practice. Next slide, please. So in the United States, I'm going to give you a very quick summary of the conditions for public education and teacher education in the United States, starting with the students who attend public schools in the United States. We have public schools or state schools or government schools, depending on the term used in specific countries. We have religious schools and we have private schools. in the United States, about 84% of students between the ages of 5 and 17 attend public schools. The majority of these students in public schools in the United States are non-white. The term students of color is used in the United States. And they live in poverty as measured by their qualifications for federal assistance that used to exist before the recent regime took over the United States. Many of those programs to support students living in poverty have disappeared in a very short time. Public schools in the United States are highly segregated by race and social class, meaning that there are students from different racial backgrounds they overlap and attend some same schools some of the time, but there's a high degree of separation or segregation. We made some progress in the United States since the 1960s, and a lot of that has disappeared for a variety of reasons. So we have segregated schools, and we have schools in these communities that are dominated by students of color living in poverty that receive less government funding than schools in other communities, more advantaged communities. And they also have teachers who are less experienced and less well prepared. And one of the reasons they have less experienced teachers is there's a very high turnover rates in these schools in historically minoritized communities. Next slide. These communities have been impacted by systemic oppression, such as the marginalization based on race, class, language, and immigration status. Next slide. The teachers and the schools in the United States. They're close to 4 million public school teachers in the United States. Over 3/4 of the schools that exist, elementary, secondary schools, are public. About 80% of teachers in US public schools are white, even though the majority of students are not white. And the majority of teachers in US public schools are monolingual English speakers. They only speak English. There are over 300 languages spoken by students in US public schools, approximately 300 languages. And as I mentioned before, families in historically marginalized communities have less access to fully prepared teachers, and I'll explain in a little while what that means, and to experienced teachers. Next slide, please. And there are various challenges that stem from these demographics. They are that teacher candidates who enter teacher preparation programs often come from middle-class communities, and they often have very little knowledge and experience with the communities in which the types of communities in which their students live. And one consequence of that is that students in schools in historically marginalized communities very often do not see their lives out of school reflected in school. So the teachers are teaching in ways that are not reflective of the world in which those students live in those communities. And in fact, this has been documented over and over again, pretty much throughout my career of 50 years or so, that teacher candidates who are learning to teach often see themselves as missionaries trying to save these students from their supposedly broken communities. And so there's this deficit perspective that is often taken. And so they don't want to contribute to the teachers, don't want to contribute to the communities. They want to help students escape those communities to have a better life. The result from all of these factors is high rates of failure for students in historically minoritized communities. Next slide, please. Teacher education in the United States is a vast enterprise. There are over 26,000 teacher education programs and over 2,100 institutions, colleges and universities, nonprofits, school districts who run their own programs. There are several community-based programs in indigenous communities, for example. Very large enterprise. Most teachers are still prepared in public universities, despite all the different participants in teacher preparation. There are also many, many different kinds of teacher preparation programs in the United States. I won't get into all the different kinds, but the main difference between these programs that matters is between traditional and alternative programs. A traditional program is one where the teacher candidate completes the program, and the program includes a period of supervised clinical experience in a school and in many cases, in some cases, communities as well, before they are fully legally responsible for a classroom. An alternative program is basically learning to teach on the job while you're teaching. As a full-time teacher taking classes at night, and often in these programs, the alternative programs, there is no supervised and mentored clinical experience. So these are the big differences in types of programs. Next slide, please. And on top of all this, there are a number of resource challenges right now that exist. We have very severe teacher shortages. They vary by location in the country, but they exist everywhere. We have a drop in enrollments in teacher preparation programs because the programs have become more expensive. And we have low teacher salaries in compared to other occupations with similar educational requirements to enter those occupations. And one of the reasons that the cost of teacher preparation to go into a program has become so expensive is that the government has cut a lot of the funding to the public universities that prepare most teachers in the United States. This has been going on for a while. This is not only a result of the recent regime change in the United States to what we have now. Now other cuts have hit universities.
Outros cortes atingiram as universidades nos últimos meses. Todo o seu apoio de pesquisa federal foi cortado e uma gama de outras coisas. Isso significa que as universidades têm que aumentar o custo aos alunos para entrar na programas de treinamento de professores. Devido a essa falta de professores, que muitos não conseguem pagar, entrar nos programas que exigem abrir mão de um emprego de tempo integral para estar no programa. Algumas exceções nisso, mas no geral é uma questão de não conseguir pagar uma faculdade. Os 50 estados, a maioria todos reduziram as exigências de pessoas entrarem nas escolas e ensinar. Em alguns casos, em alguns estados, basicamente, você tem que ter formação de uma universidade de qualquer assunto e você pode entrar e lecionar. E isso é uma realidade hoje nos Estados Unidos. Esses cortes de financiamento, falta de recursos, afetaram não somente os professores necessários nas escolas, mas também afetaram os programas de treinamento de ensino de professores de licenciatura. Os cursos, os grupos docentes perderam recursos, então o pessoal reduziu, e então as condições de educação, treinamento de professores são mais difíceis. Você tem mais alunos em cada turma, mais alunos para supervisionar nas experiências clínicas e um fator muito importante que tem mais instrutores de tempo parcial, porque a universidade não pode se comprometer para ter tantos professores de tempo integral dentro, como faziam no passado, para se comprometer com isso. O que nós vimos foi a terceirização de treinamento de professores em muitos lugares para professores de tempo parcial, muitos dos quais são muito bons, mas que não são de tempo integral. E a perspectiva no treinamento dos professores ensina um curso específico, supervisionar alguns alunos e não o programa como um todo. Uma das coisas mais importantes na qualidade de professores, de programas de preparação de professores, é a coerência do programa. E então, essa mudança, a contratação de pessoas de tempo parcial teve um efeito negativo na capacidade de manter a coerência nos programas de preparação de professores. Esses estão distribuídos em certas famílias, as pessoas que fazem preparação, a maioria dos ensinam nas escolas, a maioria que vem desses programas alternativos, nós ensinamos a ensinar, acabam ensinando nas escolas, em comunidades historicamente marginalizadas. Professores de cor que ainda são uma minoria na população de ensino, embora os professores de alunos de cor são a maioria, os professores de cor são desproporcionalmente preparados. Eu que estou com a tecla errada.
And thus there's high turnover in the schools in these communities. Teacher educators, many of them come from middle-class backgrounds, as I said before, and they have little knowledge. They come into these schools with little knowledge of the communities in which they're preparing, in which their teacher candidates are learning to teach. Next slide. A traditional model of teacher education in the United States has a university or a college or a nonprofit in recent years, and collaborating with a school in some way, usually a superficial way. The communities that are supposed to be served by the schools and by the teachers prepared to go into those schools are most often, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, only marginally connected to both the schools and the teacher preparation programs in the majority of cases. And so this is sort of, there are many different versions of this, but there's a very loose connection, and it's a very university-centric model where the university's knowledge is dominant and others are brought in to react to things that were designed by university faculty. This is a model that still is very dominant and is dysfunctional. It needs to change in the United States. Next slide. So I see the real challenge in the United States, and I think also in many other countries in the world. For example, there are over 60 countries that have a Teach for All program, sort of an offshoot of Teach for America in the United States, learning to teach on the job, learning to teach other people's children on the job. And so these issues that I've been describing are present in other countries. But I'm focused on the United States, and this is the big challenge for schools and teacher preparation programs in the United States. How to prepare teachers for historically minoritized communities highly impacted by poverty, who are well prepared and who will stay there over time, and provide an education that's reflective of the lives of students in the broader community. So, the current structures for teacher education have not worked well. We need new structures, and where ownership and responsibility for teacher preparation is shared by colleges, universities, states, nonprofits or NGOs, public school districts, and local communities. When I use the term schools or school as a part of a partnership, I need to distinguish between just a school district as a partner and a teacher union as also a partner. And one of the things I learned over the years is that working with a school district as a partner in a teacher education partnership does not necessarily reflect the interest of classroom teachers. Let's see, I'm getting a message here. Oh, it's not from you. I thought I had a message from you. Excuse me. So we need these new structures. In the past, teacher education partnerships that have involved schools, universities, and at times communities have been very superficial and have not accessed the expertise in schools and universities. Next slide, please. So I have been, for a number of years, experimenting in writing and in practice with a variety of forms of hybrid models of partnerships in teacher education, whether it's a university or a non-university provider, like a school district, a nonprofit, or so on. In my state, Washington, a teachers union has started its own teacher preparation program. And so there are many different sponsors. The school and teacher union or association, and the communities that are supposed to be served by these schools, and the teachers who are prepared to teach in them. Next slide, please. Now, I said before that many of these partnerships have been very superficial, partnerships in name only, where the real power still resides with university teacher educators. And so what matters in these partnerships is transcending a university-centric perspective where everything that's conceptualized and created and implemented is seen mainly from the perspective of those of us at universities. That needs to change in my country. And we need to also changed the idea of who's to benefit from these partnerships in teacher education. Most of the time, at least through my experience, these partnerships are viewed as mainly benefiting the teacher preparation programs, and less often to also benefiting the schools and the communities. All these entities that participate in the partnership have needs, they have desires, and it's not just a partnership that brings these groups together to prepare better teachers. It needs to do that, but also addressing some of the needs in schools and communities. And I can talk about that later if there are questions. There needs to be an epistemological shift from the very typical hierarchy that exists to a new form of professionalism for teacher educators. We're not giving up our professionalism by letting in people from schools, people from communities, and giving them a higher status in terms of creating, conceptualizing, and implementing the programs. We need to step out of our university perspective lenses and look at things more broadly, including from the perspective of our partners. Next slide, please. And some of the things that need to take place to make this happen are that the typical model is that the university brings in or goes out and talks to people about what the university has conceptualized and then asks for them for their reactions. It's already been created. What we need to do is to include school and community participants from the very beginning in the conceptualization and development process, and I would argue in the implementation process for the ongoing recreation and development and improvement of a teacher preparation program. And we can't easily do this because the university dominance has been historically the case. And there is in this country, and I assume in some other situations as well, a great deal of distrust of those of us in universities that exist in schools and these communities. And so we have to, before we can do anything, build relationships of trust with our partners, and to convince them that we're serious about a more equitable partnership and not just repeating the sort of university dominance, looking for the okay of things that we have created for them. And we need to earn that trust over time and display humility and openness to learning from them. And we need to, as part of that process, have a broader acceptance of different forms of knowledge, for example, experiential knowledge and different ways of conveying that knowledge. For example, some of the community-based teacher educators that we have worked with in Seattle would come in and tell stories about their experiences in school, their children's experiences in school, and the students were very moved and affected by the ways in which the people in the community, from the communities, communicated. It wasn't the typical professorial way of operating in a university context. And one consequence of allowing them to do that and encouraging them to speak in their own voices, in their own ways, was that created some problems for me within the university. and people saying to me at times, we need to teach those people how to teach like we teach. And my response would be, we really don't need to do that, because we want our candidates to benefit from what they have to offer. And the best way to do that is to let them speak and interact in the ways that they're comfortable with. And our research showed that the teacher candidates saw a great deal of authenticity in what they were hearing and learning from the community mentors that were working with them. Next slide, please. So often it's the case where people, for example, have pointed out to me when I go around looking at collaborations, partnerships in teacher education. Look, in this meeting here, there are teachers here, there are community, representatives from NGOs, or look how collaborative we are. But the truth is, it's not just who's in the room and seated at the table that matters, but also whose voices are heard and whose knowledge counts. And so we need to look deeper than who's invited and who's sitting there to assess the quality of the collaboration that we have. Next slide, please. Most of the conversation, not only here in the United States, but in what I've read somewhat in the international literature, at least the international literature in English language, is that schools and university partnerships. And that's been the dominant theme in partnership work in teacher education for my whole career. But I also know that there's been an argument made for including communities, particularly historically marginalized communities, in these partnerships as full partners for a long time. It's just that not a lot of teacher preparation programs have done that. And it's a problem, because when schools are not inclusive of communities' languages, practices, and knowledge, they tend to alienate students, their families, and they put these students at continued risk for failure in schools. Next slide. I would argue that all teachers should see students not as individual students only, but as members of families and cultural communities, and that their job is to work to connect their own classrooms to family and community knowledge and resources. In other words, we need the knowledge in those communities where students live, and they have a lot of resources that they can offer to help us do a better job of it. And that we need, as teacher educators, to see our work as part of a broader constellation of effort in communities as working for greater humanity and justice inside and outside education. And so it's important, the improvement of teacher education programs is a legitimate concern that we have, because that's our job. But we also need to be concerned with what do communities want, what are they working for to better, and what do the schools need and want and trying to improve. And we need to bring those together and all help each other achieve these various goals. Teacher education partnerships cannot only be about improving teacher education. Next slide, please. And so in the end, schools cannot teach children well if teachers lack an understanding of their students' cultures and lives, and if they lack meaningful relationships with their families. And so including the communities in these partnerships, I would argue, is an essential feature that needs to be addressed. Next slide. And this idea of teachers now who see themselves as trying to help students escape their communities when they get older, that needs to change to see ourselves as teacher educators working with and for communities instead of trying to save students from their communities. There's wisdom, there's expertise in those communities, and we need to recognize it and not just to have a deficit view of the communities. Next slide. Those programs that have included some coursework and effort to try to help students work with families and to learn about communities have taken an approach that is problematic. Because, next slide, they've taken an approach that does things like have the teacher candidates read a book. This is an actual book that was used in a program about how to communicate with parents, and in many cases, how to get them to listen to what we want them to do, not for us to listen to them tell us what they'd like us to do as teachers or teacher educators. And this approach, from my perspective, is problematic. But the little work that's been done with preparing teachers to work with families and communities has been of this type. Next slide. These are some photos, the next few photos from some work that we've done in University of Washington. Just some examples of some of the different ways in which to prepare teachers to work with families and communities and to recognize the expertise there that exists there. Different ways in which that can be done, and these are a few of the ones that we have. This photo is of a group of parents coming into a university class at the beginning of the year, talking with teacher candidates about their own experiences with the schools in Seattle. And for some of them, their experiences with their kids in those schools, which in many cases have been very problematic. And so this is an example of sort of, come into a class and speak. Next slide, please. Next. Another approach that we used was to try to get help candidates and community mentors develop relationships with each other over time. So one of the things that was done was to bring teacher candidates and community mentors together in but geographically, schools in a particular area, and they would meet periodically in smaller groups, having more intimate conversations and learning to trust and each other. And some things would come out in these smaller events where people got to know each other over time that wouldn't necessarily come out in a setting of bringing somebody into a university class. Next slide, please. I would argue that community members are mostly untapped sources of knowledge and guidance in preparing teachers. They're uniquely qualified experts on their own children and their own sociocultural contexts. And when we're talking about this sort of major problem that that I've been focused on, and I would argue in the United States is the major issue in teacher education, preparing teachers to work in historically minoritized communities. You can't do a good job preparing teachers unless you tap into this expertise and wealth in the communities. Next slide, please. This is another example of another thing that was done. One of the things that community members know is, particularly the elders in these communities, they have knowledge and in many cases experience with historical struggles for justice in education and beyond. And so in the United States, in Seattle, where I live now, there's a history of civil rights struggles, struggles for civil rights, voting rights, access to resources, and so on. And then you have teacher candidates coming into schools in, say, 2025, learning to teach. They don't have any sense in many cases of the historical trajectory of these communities and the histories that exist. And so we felt it was important to try to educate the teacher candidates about the historical struggles in the communities they're teaching in now, because they're still evident in a lot of ways in the context in which the candidates are teaching now. Next slide. The other thing is Seattle's a very, like many cities in the United States, very diverse, different racial, religious groups, and so on. Immigrants from different countries. And so there are organizations in the community that help work with different sectors in the community, including education. And so this is an example of a group from an Islamic Relations Committee coming in and interacting with teacher candidates in a class, trying to educate them about the communities that they're teaching in and what the needs are. And it's a point of contact with a broader context rather than just going into classrooms and seeing students and not knowing much about the context in which those students live. Next. This is another one that indicates it's not just professionals that in organizations and so on that they need to interact with. There's valuable expertise that exists in a lot of places. This is not a common example, but it's one that was adopted by one of our the teacher education programs at University of Washington, the residency program, where one of the school principals in Seattle was working with a group of African American men in I guess you would call it a detention center or a prison in near Seattle. And it was an education group where they were getting coursework while they were serving their terms for whatever they did. And the men asked the principal they wanted to be able to contribute to educating new teachers in ways that they would teach in ways where the students in schools now would not make some of the same mistakes that they saw themselves making and that ended up in incarceration. And so they planned and developed a program, and these teacher residents would go out several times a year and interact with them. And the teacher candidates found it extremely valuable. Knowledge from community members who saw some mistakes that they had made and wanted to prevent those mistakes being made by students now. And so there are multiple ways in which the communities connect. But I think it's important is to give some control both to people in schools and communities in when we collaborate with them, and not just say, I want you to come in and talk about X, Y, and Z. They need to have some agency in this process. Next slide, please. It's not only an issue of teacher education candidates. What we need are teacher educators who also are community engaged. And I would argue we as teacher educators cannot teach teachers how to teach well without knowledge of the schools and the communities in which our candidates are teaching. One consequence of many teacher educators not being familiar with those contexts is that the teacher candidates often see the coursework that they take in programs to be lack relevance to the settings in which they're learning to teach. Next slide, please. So community engaged teacher educators is teacher educators working to connect our teaching to school and community knowledge and resources and to community organizations. That we see our work as part of a broader effort in communities to work for greater educational equity and community well-being. An essential piece is that we model for our teacher candidates what it is we're asking them to go out to schools to do. That's one of the biggest complaints by teacher candidates about their teacher educators is they tell us to do this, but we don't see them doing that. And so the effect is that what we tell them or ask them to do has less of an impact on what they actually do, and it would have a greater impact if we actually modeled it for them. Next slide, please. So looking more broadly again at schools and communities and teacher preparation programs in universities or elsewhere, whoever's leading them, can be done at different levels, involving, engaging, and working in solidarity with. And I want to just quickly distinguish those ways, because what I'm talking about and arguing for is working in solidarity with. Next slide. All right, so the dominant model, most forms of collaboration, is where the university or other group, could be a school district, has organized and they run a teacher preparation program, TPP, and they periodically bring people from schools and sometimes, although less often, from communities in to react to what the university has already created. And I've seen that over and over and over again over the years, where the university has everything, they hold a meeting, they present what they've developed to the people from schools and or communities, and often take up most of the meeting presenting it. And then at the end, they say, do you have any questions? And of course, there's not time for a lot of input from the schools and communities. And so the issue here is, and it continues this way despite all the rhetoric about partnerships in teacher education, university knowledge and desires still dominate and are what counts in what actually happens. Next slide. Engagement is a different approach to this. So instead of we, the teacher educators, as the knowledgeable ones, it also stresses the knowledge that teacher educators and teacher candidates can gain from our school and community partners. And to do this, school and community partners are engaged early in the process in conceptualizing, designing, and implementing. They're part of the creation. The term co-creation has been used a lot in relationship to these kinds of partnerships. That would be engagement. But here, the focus is still on mainly preparing good teachers. Next slide, please. I've seen a worry and a doubt about what I'm arguing for by teacher educators, because some of them feel that they would be giving up their professionalism And oftentimes it's the teacher educator who has the PhD, and not necessarily the people from the schools and the communities. And so they see themselves as the knowledgeable ones. But I would argue, and there's a whole literature on this, not only in education, but in other professions, that there's another form of professionalism that does not mean giving up our voice and power, um, and our professionalism in working collaboratively, in genuinely collaborative ways with people in schools and communities. Next slide. This has been referred to as democratic professionalism. And this is a quote from Judith Sachs, an Australian teacher educator. It's a quick, very short description that I think communicates what this is about. Democratic professionalism seeks to demystify professional work and build alliances between teachers and excluded constituencies, including students, parents, and members of the community on whose behalf decisions have been made by schools or the state. So it's sort of opening up and bringing in the additional expertise and not one of giving up professionalism. So it's I'd say this has been around about 25 or more years in different professions. Democratic professionalism. Next slide, please. And I would argue that working in this way with schools and communities, from my perspective, the communities are an essential part if we're talking about historically marginalized communities. Working in solidarity, this is necessary. And so it's working in solidarity to address our needs as teacher educators, to prepare competent teachers who are going to be successful and stay over time in these communities, and eventually give families in these communities access to experienced teachers, like more advantaged communities already have that access to experienced teachers. But it's not just working to prepare teachers, that we as teacher educators need to be aware of the needs of the schools and of the communities and others who are involved in these partnerships, and to contribute to helping them address their needs. So it's a leveling of the status. Everybody's at an equal level, and we're working on preparing good teachers, but we're also working on helping, for example, teachers get working conditions that are better than they are in many cases in those schools, or helping communities get access to resources, that we're helping each other, as opposed to the sole concern being with teacher education. And I would argue that we need to start operating like that if we're going to make a dent in the United States in improving teacher education program, the preparation of teachers for historically minoritized communities in the United States. Next slide, please. This is a slide from Madison, Wisconsin. That's one of my favorites. This is the outside the Capitol building. The governor of the state took away teachers' rights to bargain for wages and benefits. And from some other lines of work in the state. And so the various groups got together and fought and demonstrated and tried to overcome collectively what was going on in the state in undermining schools, teacher education programs, workers in various fields. And one concrete example of what that means for a teacher educator is that there was a teacher strike in Seattle a few years ago, and the teachers bargained in the negotiations for things, not just their own self-interest for their pays and pay and working conditions, but they bargained for things that the community wanted and needed. They bargained for things that the schools needed. And so when we're operating, we see those needs as part of what we need to help improve. And it sort of broadens the focus of ourselves as teacher educators in ways that I would argue collectively give us more power. This same approach, by the way, is what is going on now in the United States to some extent. I don't know if you can see my little badge here, no kings, no dictators. This is something that I received last Saturday when millions of people were out in the streets of the United States demonstrating against the fascist regime that has come into existence in the last few months. Fighting these things individually, there's been a bad impact on universities and a bad impact on a lot of different things. If we only fight for our own self-interest, we're not going to accomplish very much. We need to fight collectively for our common interest and for the public good. And I would say that same kind of perspective needs to exist in the notion of collaboration within teacher education partnerships. Thank you very much.
Professor Zeichner.
Yes.
Professor Zeichner, would like to thank you for your talk, which has included yet another element in the formation of the third spaces in the education of teachers, the communities in which the schools, teachers, and universities are located, of which they are part. We can see from the two lectures that there are several converging points, but also each one of the lectures has brought specific reflections and specific examples on the education of teachers and the challenges that are related to our world reality, either here in Brazil or in the United States or in several other parts of the world. And right now, we will move on to the third part of this afternoon session, which is a debate involving not only Professor Nóvoa and Professor Zeichner, but also and especially the audience that is here with us at the Federal University of Minas Gerais auditorium, and also our audience on YouTube. We have thought about organizing this debate with blocks of 3 questions. Let's start out from 3 questions from the audience, and then after that we'll have 3 questions from YouTube, and we will continue up until we run out of time for discussion. Can we do it like this? All right, we have a microphone up front here in the auditorium for those who would like to ask questions, or also Professor Nóvoa and Professor Zeichner, if they'd like to put forth any issues for our debate, please feel free to do so.
Anotações? Nós também podemos receber perguntas por escrito.
We can also take questions in writing.
Já temos
We
professor.
have one question already.
Professor Beirão já vai
Professor
fazer uma
Beirão is
pergunta.
going to start a question.
Está funcionando aí, Tati?
Oi.
Is the microphone working? Yes, it is.
Boa
Good
tarde.
afternoon.
A pergunta é
My
para o
question
professor Nóvoa.
goes to Professor Nóvoa.
Primeiro,
First
agradecer as
first of all, I'd like to
ideias
thank you
instigantes e
for your
estimulantes que trouxe.
stimulating ideas.
Já pensando
And
em implementar algumas
thinking
coisas,
about implementing
eu fiquei
something,
curioso em relação
I
a
was
essas
curious
escolas
about the
transformadoras.
transforming
Se não me engano, esse é o
schools,
termo que o senhor usa, né?
because that's the
Como é
the
que elas
term that's
seriam
used now. How
selecionadas
are they
ou
selected, or
escolhidas
are
ou
they chosen? How are
concebidas
they
para serem
built
já implementadas
so
nesse
that
processo de
they can be
transformação
implemented
todos
in this
nós queremos?
transformation process that we want so much to happen?
Obrigado.
Thank you.
Obrigada, professor.
Thank you,
Se
Professor.
apresente, por favor.
Please
Boa tarde.
introduce
Meu nome é
yourself. Good
Roberta,
afternoon. My name is
sou
Roberta.
doutoranda do PPGE da
I'm a
UFMG.
PhD student
E
from
primeiro
the Rio de
agradecer
Janeiro
a
Federal
oportunidade de estar
University.
aqui,
First of all,
que
thank you
você
very
fez um
much
convite
for being here,
lá no
for the
exame do projeto,
invitation,
e também dizer
for my
essa
project
voz
examination,
tremenda
and
de
also
estar tão feliz de estar aqui na
uh,
presença do professor
declare that
Nóvoa,
I'm
professor
so
Zeichner,
happy to
minhas
be in the
referências
presence of
desde
Professor
o
Lockman and
início
Professor
do meu
Zeichner,
mestrado em
who
2018.
have been
E
present
nessa
in my
trajetória
education
venho
since the beginning of my
refletindo
master's
sobre a
education.
formação de
I've been
professores
thinking
em
about
desenvolvimento com a
teacher
extensão
education
universitária.
as
E hoje a
university
fala do professor
extension,
Nóvoa me instigou
and
bastante
Professor
sobre
Nóvoa's lecture has
a
instigated
questão das
the issue
320
of the
horas
320
da
hours
extensão na resolução
uh,
400 de 2024.
from Resolution
E
424.
eu queria, assim, não
And
fazer
I'd
diretamente
like
uma
to
pergunta,
not really ask a
mas
question directly,
pedir
but to ask
a sua palavra nessa
about
reflexão, para eu
your
também refletir
ideas
junto
so we can think
sobre foram
together about,
apresentadas questões positivas, né?
positive
O que
issues have
deve
been put
assegurar
forth,
esse espaço,
which must
mas
ensure the
refletir
space, but
sobre os
also we should
limites,
reflect on the limits,
pensando nas
thinking
outras
about the
perspectivas
other
que a extensão
perspectives
pode
that extension
oferecer
might
na
offer
formação de
in teacher
professores, e não
education,
apenas
not
enquanto
only how
prática
practical,
pedagógica atrelada
how
ao
pedagogical
PNPP, né?
practice is
Então,
connected to
mais uma
the
reflexão, ainda mais que a
teacher
gente viu
education, teacher
tantas
preparation
outras
program.
possibilidades a partir da
We have seen so
pandemia,
many
né?
other
A gente sabe
possibilities
que
from what
também
Professor
há
Zeichner has talked
espaço
about.
para
We know that there are
estudantes
spaces for
se formando
students to
professores em
become
projetos de
teachers
extensão, por
from
exemplo,
extension projects.
iniciativas
For
educacionais
example,
no sistema
educational
prisional,
initiatives in
hospitalar,
prison
né?
or hospital
Mais
systems.
para uma reflexão sobre esses
Well, I would
limites,
like to
nesses
come up
espaços
with
de
a reflection
referência,
about these
se são
limits
referências da
at
profissão
reference spaces. Are they
ou da
references from the
prática.
profession or from practice alone?
Então, o Júlio vai apresentar mais uma pergunta.
Julio has another question. That's from the chat.
Uma pergunta, a pessoa não
A
foi
person did not
mas
identify
aqui
themselves,
vozes do
but
currículo, não sei se é essa a identificação
it
da
says
pessoa.
voices from the curriculum. I don't know if that's the question, but the question is, how can we think about democratic education when we live in times of neo-fascist recurrence around the world? What teaching knowledge is absolutely necessary? Is the third space a way to structure a strength?
Bom, então passamos
All right, let us
palavra
give the floor
para
now to
professores
Professor
Nóvoa,
Nóvoa and Professor Zeichner.
Pois é. Sim. Julinho, o Zeichner.
O Zeichner recebeu tradução?
Is Professor Zeichner getting the translation?
Falou primeiro.
Maybe I should speak first. I don't know.
Zeichner, Ken, are you hearing me?
Yes, but I don't speak Portuguese. I can't understand anything.
Professor Zeichner precisa usar
No.
fone de ouvido para ouvir a tradução. Ele não ouviu nada da tradução.
Então, enquanto tu traduzes para o Ken, né?
eu tento dar uma.
Let me try
Tento começar esta conversa.
and start this conversation.
Sobre a primeira questão,
About the first aspect,
nós não temos modelos ideais.
we do not have ideal models. That's a bit of what I tried to say. We are trying things and we're doing things, but actually, within the Mineira network of teacher education, the Professor Valério is conducting that. At this point, we have a reasonable movement of the state schools which have been chosen for each one of the Minas Gerais institutions. They did a sort of co-optation among the schools and the State Department, and I believe that in the case of the city departments, the same thing is happening. So this is the process of creating approximations, which at UFMG, I don't know if Julia followed that up. Our dear Maria José did that, and she conducted this work really well, of talking to schools about the schools that are around us and creating some connections, some proximity. So that was not really any very organized logic. That's not the cause of that, you know. We created encounters or meetings up until we were able to reach these schools. Other countries have done this in different ways, but here in Minas Gerais, especially at UFMG, that is the logic of meetings with teachers and principals from different meetings. That's what connected them to people in the State Department of Education. And I believe that they have been picked already, in the case of UFMG at least, and most of the other 19 Minas Gerais institutions. Since, well, actually we had, in the beginning we start small, right? And then let's see how things progress. About Roberta's question, I don't know where she is now. I've tried not to talk about practice, but I couldn't run away from that, right? To me, the issue of 320 hours for extension, that has nothing to do with the practice, really. To me, that's not the point. What I believe is powerful in this the challenge for the guidelines is to say that we have to do it in the institutions, in the schools. Deep down inside, we have to try to escape a logic, which is the logic that we understand well. We at the university, we have things, we have programs, we have come up with programs, and we go to communities and we come up with several different activities, but we have to think about this logic a bit, and we have to say, no, activities must somehow be located. They must be in situ, you know, at the institutions themselves, which does not mean, in my opinion, in my way of seeing things, it does not mean at all that they are limited or connected to practices or pedagogical practices or the classroom. No, they have to be open enough. They have to be culturally open, artistically open. They must be open to other dynamics and other logics. But it's somehow they come up, they sprout from this triangle and not a logic of things that are done at the university and taken somewhere else. I believe that what is interesting in this type of obligation, which is in the national directives or guidelines, is the issue of going to other locations, of going to schools, to the communities, and that is where this dynamic of extension should be devised, of course, with your collaboration, of course, with us. But just like what Kenneth Zeichner said, not in a university-centered perspective, or what can the university do to bring extension somewhere. how can university, according to Zeichner, save the communities and save the others? Well, we have to run away from this logic. We have to think differently, but never, and I believe we can never do that, never by limiting this extension, this institution with pedagogical practice or healthy practice. And that's why I never use the word practice, and I hope I didn't use it in my talk, because it's a very limiting word. And like I said, extension was something open. It has to involve diversity. It has to support different logics. It has to be creative. It has to be open for other things. But it has to be done in situ from a different logic that will make us disconnect, displace, or dislocate, and it makes us adopt a new perspective. That's a great challenge to us. The issue put forth by Julio now, which was not Julio's question, it was from a collective called Voices from the Curriculum, right? The Voices. Angela answered the question. I believe that, Angela, that's the point to me, Of course, each one of us many times is involved in these projects, and not all of us are likewise. Not all of us have the same priorities. We have to, well, this projects are projects that demand composition, and composition also means different perspectives, different outlooks, and to me, it's been impressive along this last year, sort of. Those discussions that we have had in Minas Gerais and with several institutions here, maybe out of the 19 Minas Gerais institutions involved, I might have visited probably 12 or 13 of them, all the way from Montes Claros to Viçosa and many other places. It's important to understand the dynamics are different. There are common proposals, but different dynamics, and that's normal. Between Diamantina and Belo Horizonte, not necessarily will the dynamics be the same. To me personally, what mobilizes me the most is exactly what we have in Angela's question. It's a force. It's the constitutes a force. She uses a good word. A force is to put together a location which is at the same time a place for affirming other logics, of affirming other dynamics, affirming a democratic education, of affirming a democratic professionality, such as what was said by Professor Zeichner, affirmation of a new reality, which is actually also a struggle, a fight in these times in which we need a huge mobilization of everyone who believes in democracy, everyone who believes in culture or in knowledge, in order to fight this terrible phase that we're going through in humankind. And I believe that keeping May 68 in May, there is a game of words, and it's a beautiful game of words. It's beautiful. It's in French, but it also works in Portuguese. It would say, this is not only a debate, it's also a combat. And I believe what we're doing here in this sense is to put together, is to constitute this force, which is a force that comes from the debate, but also comes from struggle.
Professor Ken Zeichner, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I just got it. I just saw the text that came a couple of minutes ago. So I heard his last two sentences in English.
In the translations, right?
The last two sentences. I didn't understand anything he said other than that.
Yes.
You'll have to send me a transcript.
É bom porque assim pode falar do que quiser. But now you are getting the translations, right?
O senhor está
Yeah,
recebendo a
just like 2 minutes ago.
2 minutes ago. Yeah, sorry. There is one question for you, Ken.
Okay.
And this, oh, hold on.
What's the question?
There is a question here, how to think about a democratic education in this time that we live, you know, as we see neo-fascist movements and governments around the world. What kinds of teaching knowledge, you know, are really important, and then we really need in this context that we live right now. Third spaces are a way to, you know, empower these movements against fascist movements in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is the only way to deal with fascism, with marginalization of communities, that the people collectively working for the common good is the only way to overcome what's going on now. I think that the millions of people out in the streets of the United States on Saturday is not a one-time event. That needs to continue over time, working together to challenge what is going on, the marginalization of people for the interests of the few wealthy, that not only are destroying public services like education and teacher education, but also are destroying our planet. Um, and um, and so the only way is to collectively work together, which is hard. I mean, it is hard. In the years that I've tried to collaborate in teacher education across lines of schools and university, across lines of university and communities, it's hard because there's a great deal of distrust that has developed over time between these various groups. And we in the university are often seen in very negative ways. And I would say that we deserve it for the way that universities have behaved in general toward marginalized communities. Going in, for example, with doing our research and getting our PhDs and walking away and not contributing to the struggles that they're engaged in within their own spheres in the communities. So when we go out and ask them to cooperate with us, why should they trust us? And in many cases, they don't. But the only way out of this, I think, is collectively across these groups, collectively across countries. I don't see any other way. I keep, listening to certain news broadcasts in the United States where I keep hearing over and over again, the people matter, the people matter. And so it's a struggle for sure. It's not an easy struggle, but I think that we can overcome. Having become a public school teacher in the 1960s in the United States, it's very similar today in a lot of ways in terms of the government working against the people engaged in a war in Southeast Asia that didn't need to take place. thousands of Americans being killed. For what? And so that was overcome. I mean, the government was forced to back down. We got rid of one president back then, a corrupt president, and we can do it again. I mean, it's a struggle, and it's more than just one person, an evil person that we have right now running our government. It's more than that. It's a system that has benefited over time. But we can't just look out for our own interests. We have to be concerned with the interests of others, and they won't work to help us get what we need to do a good job unless we help them. I saw it happen in Wisconsin. That governor was thrown out. And I don't know what other way to say it, but I think the perspective has been too narrow in teacher education, looking at our own needs as and not being involved enough in helping people address their needs, including in education, in public schools, and in communities that are advocating for better public schools for their children.
Temos mais perguntas, por favor?
Do we
Se
have other
apresente.
questions?
Meu nome é Laura, sou estudante
My name
de
is Laura.
pedagogia.
I'm a
My
teacher
question
student.
is for Zeichner. I'm sorry, my English is not that good, so I have. Recently in Brazil, teaching training by private institutions has grown more and more. Considering a possible precariousness in professional training, that situation teaches in the reality of the students, how we can get around the market logic to professional training the teachers.
Mas nós vamos fazer bloco com 3 perguntas, tá? Mais uma, Samira, por favor.
They're going to take several other questions, and then you come back to answer. Okay, thank you.
Na gestão anterior desta reitoria, o professor Takahashi era pró-reitor de graduação, foi criado um programa chamado PIEBS, que era o Programa de Integração com a Educação Básica, que tinha esta preocupação de trazer a possibilidade de trabalho articulado entre professores da escola básica e da universidade no período do estágio. Eu fui convidada a participar deste programa e fizemos um edital convidando as escolas
We did that. We invited the schools that wanted to integrate from some conditions. We had more than 100 schools were in the program, and Professor Takahashi and I began the work visiting schools. We visited 2 schools on Saturday mornings in a meeting of all the teachers of the school. We raised the question and we discussed this. And there's a set of other steps, and it didn't work out. At the end of the day, myself as coordinator of the program made a report showing there were many points that were not solved in that experience. Well, I'm saying this to say that with this debate, with this phase of discussion, many of the questions are raised, very well stated, and there's a very adequate solution for you to begin a process such as this. As Professor Nóvoa said, a rich path and to be followed where these ideas and these proposals can be built. I had a doubt if I made this statement because I'm going to raise another problem, given these many that are challenges we have to face. There are several courses, differently from what I know. In Europe, for example, we do a path training since the beginning of the course. We don't have a separate phase of studying the content and the teacher training. We do them together. And the new legislation proposed that should be even closer, beginning in the very first year. I have a fear that the study of specific content, certainly of different teacher training courses, I don't know all of them, is very different from the point of view that we want to have building with teachers from basic education. It means that the study of more specific knowledge, history, story, etc., occurs with the logic of theory, practice of the school. It is in the logic of very academic, very often. It is, don't study what the teacher is actually going to teach. He doesn't study conceptually complete what he will have to teach. He will go to the teaching book to do this. That is the question of specific content study comes in. I have a doubt whether I say this. No, maybe when we move forward from this point of view, this question will be raised. I'm in math, I teach in mathematics. It's very different what you think of education and teacher training than what you study when you study math, which is essential. All the teachers have to have scientific depth. I ask to think about this, if possible, and if it's adequate at the moment. Thank you, Samira. Eduardo Mota.
A questão é para o Zeichner. Eu vou tentar falar em inglês.
Question. Let me try and say it in English. The question is to Professor Zeichner.
I think teacher education is a kind of intercultural thing. We need to develop intercultural views to be able to do the teacher education. But intercultural education normally is based on this, let's say, mutual coincidence in terms of knowledge, because each community has his own knowledge, and if you need to do something together, you need to look at the knowledge and see what kind of convergence do you have in this kind of things. So my question is just is something very hard to try because when we prepare education, intercultural education, you need to deep in the community, the community habits, the community views. So I'm wondering if what is need for this intercultural education in teacher education.
Can I respond to that right now? Can I?
There are other two questions from chat. So the first one, the person is called Lírio de Souza, and his question is, this question is to Professor Zeichner. What do you think about mixing the third space perspective and the multi-literacies perspectives? I don't know if you know this perspective, multiple literacy perspective. So it is possible to mix third space perspective and multiple literacy perspective. This is one question. The other question is how to think about constructing a third space if this idea if this idea gets directly to democratizing principles and collective work. Essentially common principles and ideas. So in this sense, how to overcome the myself logic, or the logic focused on only on myself, to a collective perspective, and to thinking about common goods, to thinking about common goals and common struggles. So, and how to do that in initial teacher education and in-service teacher education.
Am I supposed to respond now?
Go ahead.
Okay. There were a lot of questions and a lot of things in those questions. I just want to start by talking about this notion of convergence and the intercultural, and how do we get to this sort of common, working for the common good when we all have our own interests. And one of the things I would say is that, based on my experience, is that the goal for me has always been to find common ground, things on which we agree when we get school, community, university folks together. There's going to be disagreements that continue. So the idea that we're suddenly going to agree upon anything is a fantasy. It's not going to happen. But the focus, if we can come to sort of a common set of things that we agree on to improve, for the moment, the quality of teacher preparation, we need to learn to move on that common interest and the things that we agree on and move ahead there. And that's hard because we've been separated so long, and there's a lot of antagonism between the different sectors that developed over time. So you can't just suddenly drop in people in the room and say, work together collaboratively and have it happen very easily. My experience is it takes a while to develop trust. You can't do anything until that trust is developed. You need to be open about the things on which you continue to disagree, and focus on the things that you agree on that are going to help push education and teacher education and the communities in which they happen forward to a better place. But everybody's not going to be loving each other by the end of it. It's not like a fantasy movie where you press a button and suddenly everybody forgets all the things of the past and is marching down arm in arm on the streets. But to some extent, you can do that. So out on the streets on Saturday in the United States were people who continue to disagree about a lot of things, but they have a common hatred of the government in power. And so they were, working together to try to accomplish something that they agree on. And one of the areas, there was this question early on about privatization of schools, and that's something I've been against for a long time, using public tax money to pay for private schools, often for wealthy families. And there are people that I've worked with in developing programs in teacher education collaboratively who were big advocates of that perspective. And so I had to keep focusing on what we could accomplish together. And another thing about, everything we believe may not be correct, to be open to that. And the proliferation of different kinds of teacher preparation programs has been a big problem in the United States because many of them are awful and are motivated by profit and trying to make money and not to actually improve the education for kids living in poverty in the country. And so the focus that I've come to take in recent years is evidenced by a report that I just worked on with a group of people that looked at improving and evaluating teacher preparation programs in the United States. I've come to accept the reality of privatized programs, to accept the reality of alternative programs that put people on the job in without full preparation. But what I think is important is to have common standards for authorizing programs to operate, to look at the results. And so I've put aside some of my biases and started focusing on, I want the government to approve programs for operating that meet certain standards. And there are many different ways to do that that I have not thought of, that I may have been wrong about. But the thing is to stop those underprepared teachers from going into these communities and harming kids. And so I've tried to open up and work more closely with people that in the past I might have said that, we can't work together because they're advocating privatization. I think the results are what counts. And this idea of it being a struggle, yes, it is a struggle. It's definitely not easy. And if it appears to be too easy, you're doing something wrong. Struggle is part of the process. Well, I don't even know if you can hear me, but I'll stop there.
Eu vou atrever-me a fazer comentário sobre a
I'm going
primeira
to make a comment about the first question. Hey, your name, I'm sorry, about pedagogy. Yes. I'm going to make a comment center about the first question, and then I'll center on the question of Professor Zenira, and then I'll leave about the last question, the idea of the commune. The first question is very simple terms. What happens in Brazil has no comparison with any other country. 85% of the teachers are trained in private institutions, a great majority at this and a great majority in there's no other place in the world. You saw by the numbers of Kenneth Zeichner that he showed at the beginning, and the country in the United States public. It seems a situation, a unique aspect in the birth. There's no country in the world, no nation, no America, Europe, anywhere in the world. This is a real huge concern. You have to have something has to be done. You have to do something. And the first thing that has to be done, and for this, I think it's so important, this project, the universities should take on their responsibility, because the public universities train teachers, but without prioritizing this. They have to establish this as a first priority, with giving visibility to this inside the universities in a fragmented way today. That's why it brings this project as well. The project are going to save the world. It's not the one that's going to save anybody, but at least can cover our responsibility in a situation which is unique in the world, in the worst sense of the term, unfortunately. The question that Professor Samida raises is central. It is a question that of huge complexity and very relevant. When we begin to work on this issue, and that is very important, these things don't come from nowhere. There's a lot behind it. Some that worked, others that didn't, but there is a heritage of stuff which allows us to be here today. One of the most important is the experience and the work in it. Most, the greater part, this heritage of experiences that allows us to breathe and go a bit further, or expect to go further from the point of view of institutional point of view in creating these first steps. In the first discussions I had here in UFMG about a year ago, it was seen immediately, well, it's normal. I'm saying this not in the negative sense. Many assistants, a lot of teachers of areas, specific areas of knowledge, many problems on this kind. My suggestion of Maria José or Julio or Bruno to the president of the university, the people who worked, was to say, let's try to concentrate initially on the block 4 of the guidelines and the block of extension and the block of the internships, because they are defined very clearly in the curricular guidelines, and not so much on block 1, the general training with 880 hours, and block 2 of specific knowledge. Not because it's not important, because they are a math person. A teacher has to know an awful lot of math, but is it math? Is it only math that he needs, or is it a different kind of math? Is it a central question? It's a debate which is extremely important. But what I said here in UFMG is that we cannot attack all the problems at the same time. We have to prioritize, and I believe to begin from here, we one day will have to get to this stage to know what is math and cover all the areas. For example, in my opinion, it is not less math, but it's math which is different. Something that I've always said about this is that math teacher, history, biology, probably needs to know much more about the story of math than a scientist math who doesn't need to know so much about the history of the discipline, because the history of a subject is essential for us to be able to teach. There are components of this specific knowledge that has to be worked on. The problem is that you cannot, at the same time, strategically, in my opinion, was partly received by the colleagues of the Mineda network, concentrate on block 13, block 4, a lot of material to work now, knowing that sooner or later we have to get to the other blocks.
Mas é debate que é muito importante que tenha aqui trazido, não é? Finalmente, o último debate sobre a ideia do comum, eu reitero aqui, nesta mesma sala e neste mesmo auditório, nós tivemos aqui uma discussão com a Carmen há 3 meses, talvez, com a professora Carmen, Teresa Gabriel da Universidade Federal do Rio de
from
Janeiro,
the Federal
que é
University of
diretora
Rio.
do complexo
She is the
de
director
professores,
of
aqui em
the
Passo,
complex of
foi a primeira
teacher
criação
education, which
institucional
was
do
the first
Brasil
institutional creation in
do terceiro
Brazil,
espaço, não é? Na altura,
including
estive
the
lá em
third
2017, a
space.
convite do professor
I was
Roberto
there in
Lera, que na altura era o reitor da
2017 at
UFMJ, e com a Carmen e
by
com muitos
invitation
outros
of
colegas,
Professor Roberto Lara
construiu-se a ideia do
and
complexo,
Carmen.
e
We
justamente a
put together the idea of
intervenção
the complex,
de
and that
Carmen, da
was
professora Carmen
Carmen's
Gabriel,
intervention,
nesta
Professor
mesa,
Carmen,
está
here
sentada a
at
Rita,
this
na cadeira que
panel
está
with
sentada a Rita,
the
foi sobre a
same
ideia
chair
do
where
comum.
Rita is sitting now.
E
She
sobre a
was
ideia
talking
do
about the
comum,
idea of the
explicando-a de
common,
uma maneira absolutamente
and she
notável,
explained in an
desse
absolutely
comum
noteworthy
do
way.
espaço comum,
She was talking
que
about the common
não é
common space
de maneira
not being
nenhuma
at
o
all
menor denominador
the
comum, não é a ideia de
smaller
encontrar
common
uma
denominator.
coisa,
That's not the idea of finding
uma coisa
something
que de algum modo
that
define o nosso
somehow
menor denominador comum,
we
não é
will
isso,
define as
mas é
our smaller
muito
common
do que o
denominator.
Zeichner aqui
That's
nos
not what
falou,
it is,
é
but
o
it's a lot of what
trabalho em
Professor
comum,
Zeichner
o
talked about, the
trabalho em
work
comum,
in common,
independentemente dos
common work,
outros,
regardless of who
independentemente
we
das
are,
nossas
regardless of our
diversidades,
diversity,
independentemente dos nossos pontos de
regardless of
vista,
our different points of
independentemente
view,
das nossas
regardless of
identidades.
our
Não se trata, pois,
identities.
de
This
construir
is
uma
not about
identidade comum, não é
building
esse o
about
ponto.
a common identity.
Trata-se
That's not the point.
de
It's about
construir as bases
building
para um
the
trabalho em
basis
comum,
for
para uma
work in common,
partilha em comum,
for
a partir
sharing in
de
common,
diferentes lugares,
sharing
diferentes perspectivas,
from
diferentes
different
pontos de vista,
locations, different
e a
perspectives, and different
intervenção
points of
aqui
view.
da
And
Carmen, da
Carmen's,
professora Carmen Gabriel, que
Professor
para
Carmen
ela,
Gabriel's intervention
ela já está
here
gravada,
has been
praticamente ao
recorded.
longo de uma hora,
She
a
talked about
explicar isto
1
que eu estou
hour
a tentar explicar
explaining
em
this,
2
which is
minutos,
what I'm
uma
trying to
intervenção
explain in 2
particularmente
minutes. It was a
importante para
particularly important
desfazer
intervention in order to
daquela ideia
undo
de um
the
comum
idea
que
of a
fosse
common,
unificador,
which
que
is
fosse
unifying,
homogeneizador. Não é disso que se
homogenizing.
trata,
That's not
é
what
da
it's all
ideia
about.
do
It's
trabalho
about
em
the
comum.
idea of
Aliás,
working in common.
curiosamente,
Actually,
é um
curiously,
conceito, não é?
that's
Muito
a
trabalhado pelo próprio George
concept
Dewey,
that's
como
been worked
sabem,
by George
traduzido no
B.O.,
Brasil pelo Anísio Teixeira,
translated in Brazil by
nomeadamente
Anísio
na sua
Teixeira,
obra sobre
in his
educação
work
e
about education and
democracia, não é? Por isso
democracy,
casa muito bem
but
com a
it
ideia
goes
de
hand in hand with
democratização,
the idea
em
of
que ele justamente
democratization.
falava
And
dessa
he
ideia
talked
do comum
about
a partir
this
da
idea of
comunicação,
common from communication,
explicando que a raiz de comunicação estava no
explaining that
comum
the root
e
of
que não era
communication is in
comunicar
common,
com
and the
outro, é
common
entrar
means
em diálogo com
communicating
o
with
outro,
the other,
conversar com o
of
outro, trabalhar com o outro,
working with the
e
other,
não
conversing with the other,
construir uma
and
qualquer identidade
not
comum que
construction a common activity
homogenizasse e nos
identity that would
unificasse, não é?
homogenize
É,
us or
é curioso
identify
que
us.
esta tenha sido
So
a
much so
última
that it's
pergunta deste
curious
debate,
that
não é?
this
Porque
was the
trazes
last
aqui
question in this
a
discussion, because it
reflexão
brings
da
about a
Carmen
discussion,
Gabriel,
a reflection of what of
na
Carmen
verdade, muito
Gabriel's words, which
inspiradora,
was actually very
tê-la aqui
inspiring to
justamente
have
ao
her
longo de
here
quase uma hora
along
a
a
trabalhar
whole
sobre
hour
sobre
almost
esse
working
conceito.
on this concept.
Então, agradecemos,
All right,
então,
so
ao
we would
professor
like to
Nóvoa,
thank
ao
Professor
professor
Nóvoa and
Zeichner,
Professor Zeichner
pelas
for
palestras
their
e
lectures and
pelo debate que
for the
se
discussion
seguirão.
that ensued.
E agradecemos
And would
também
like
a
also to
plateia
thank the
e os leitores
audience,
pela participação.
both in
E
person
vamos
and
encaminhando
on
para a
YouTube for
próxima
their
atividade.
participation. We will move ahead to our next activity. Thank you very much.
Então, pessoal, fechando, né? O desafio está posto pelos nossos palestrantes de hoje. Estabelecer esse encontro
Challenge
entre
has been put
universidade,
forth.
escola e
We want to
educação
establish
básica.
this meeting
Esse encontro
between the
deve ser um
schools,
dos
universities, and
espaços,
basic
terceiro
education. That's
espaço,
what
né?
we call the third space.
Zeichner chama de espaços híbridos
Zeichner
e o
calls them
professor
hybrid
Nóvoa
spaces, and
de
Professor
espaço
Nova calls them
trabalho comum,
common
né? Bem
work,
definido na
right?
sua última
As well
intervenção
defined in
hoje.
his last
Continuamos a
talk.
caminhar
We continue
juntos,
walking
né?
together, right?
E
And
gostaríamos que
we would
vocês
like for you
permanecessem
to remain
conosco
here with
agora.
us.
Nós temos
We
uma outra
will have
atividade muito
another activity
importante,
that's very
o
important.
lançamento do
It's
livro
the
do Prodoc,
release of
né?
the
E
Crodoc
também
book.
permaneçam,
And also would
retornem à
like
cidade
to
amanhã
ask
e
you to come
teremos
back
duas mesas
here tomorrow,
redondas, uma
because we
roda
will
de
have two
conversa
round tables and
envolvendo
a
todos os nossos
conversation
grupos de
involving
pesquisa
all
e
of our research and
organizações
organization
que estão
groups, which are
editando esse evento.
editing this event. Thank you very much.
Agora eu vou tomar um cafezinho.
Você tá ótimo. Você tá ótimo.
Aliás, antes,